Imagine standing on the edge of a dark, icy harbor in the year 1773. The air is so cold it stings your lungs, and the smell of salt water mixes with the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Around you, the town of Boston is buzzing with a nervous energy that feels like a physical weight. People are whispering in taverns, lanterns are flickering in windows, and three massive British ships sit heavily in the water, loaded with tea that no one wants to buy. This isn't just a story about a protest. It's a story about the exact moment a group of ordinary people decided they had finally had enough. This is the night that changed the world forever. This is the night America rebelled over tea. To understand why a city would go crazy over a few crates of tea, you have to understand what it felt like to live in Boston in the 1770s. For years, the people living in the American colonies felt like they were being treated like second-class citizens. They were English subjects, but they didn't feel like they had the same rights as the people living back in London. The biggest issue was taxes. The British Parliament, which was thousands of miles across the ocean, kept passing laws that forced the colonists to pay extra money on things they used every day: paper, glass, paint, and, most importantly, tea. Now, it wasn't just about the money. Most people could afford the few extra pennies. It was the principle of the thing. The colonists had no one representing them in the British government. They had no voice. They would say, "No taxation without representation," and they meant it. It was a matter of respect. They felt like the king and his ministers were reaching into their pockets whenever they felt like it, without even asking. By 1773, most of those taxes had been taken away because the colonists protested so hard. But the king kept the tax on tea. He wanted to show the Americans that he still had the power to tax them. He also wanted to help out a struggling company called the East India Company. The plan was simple. The company would send millions of pounds of tea to the colonies, sell it at a low price, but keep that small tax attached. The British thought the colonists would be so happy to have cheap tea that they would just pay the tax and move on. But the people of Boston weren't looking for a bargain. They were looking for freedom. In the weeks leading up to the rebellion, the mood in the city was dark. You couldn't walk down the street without hearing an argument about the Tea Act. In the local pubs, men like Samuel Adams were speaking to crowds, telling them that if they paid this tax, they were basically admitting that they were slaves to the king's will. They saw the tea not as a drink, but as a symbol of their loss of liberty. Every time a ship full of tea set sail from England, it was like a countdown clock had started ticking toward a massive explosion. The tension wasn't just in the politics. It was in the very air people breathed. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion or shared a silent nod of agreement. They knew something big was coming, even if they didn't know exactly what it would look like yet. On a cold Sunday morning in late November, the news spread through the streets of Boston like wildfire. The ship Dartmouth had been spotted entering the harbor. It wasn't just any ship. It was carrying 114 chests of the East India Company's tea. For the people of Boston, this was the moment they had been dreading. The tea was here. As the Dartmouth pulled up to Griffin's Wharf, the townspeople gathered to watch. There was no cheering. People stood in silence, watching the sailors tie the heavy ropes to the docks. The ship looked massive and intimidating, a floating piece of the British Empire sitting right in their backyard. Shortly after, two more ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver, arrived and docked nearby. Combined, they were carrying over 340 chests of tea. That was nearly 92,000 pounds of tea leaves, enough to brew millions of cups. But the colonists had a plan. They didn't want the tea unloaded. Under the law, once a ship docked, it had 20 days to unload its cargo and pay the taxes. If the tea stayed on the ship for 21 days, the British government had the right to seize the cargo by force, unload it themselves, and sell it to pay the taxes. This created a deadline. The clock was officially running. The men of Boston, organized by a group called the Committee of Correspondence, set up a watch. They didn't want a single chest of tea to be moved off those ships. Day and night, groups of 25 men armed with muskets and clubs patrolled the wharves. They made sure no one tried to sneak the tea off the boats under the cover of darkness. It was a tense standoff. On one side, you had the ship captains who just wanted to do their jobs. On the other, you had the British governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who insisted the ship stay until the tax was paid. And in the middle, you had the people of Boston, who were determined that the tea would never touch American soil. The sailors on the ships were nervous. They could see the men on the docks watching their every move. At night, the only light came from the lanterns of the guards and the stars reflecting off the cold harbor water. The captains of the ships were caught in the middle of a fight they didn't want. They were responsible for the cargo, but they also didn't want their ships burned down by an angry mob. Every day that passed without the tea being unloaded was a victory for the colonists, but it also brought the final deadline closer. The people of Boston knew that once those 20 days were up, the British soldiers in the nearby fort, Castle William, would move in. The peace was fragile, and everyone knew it wouldn't last. As the days ticked by, the tension in the city became almost unbearable. The Old South Meeting House became the heart of the resistance. It was the largest building in Boston, and it was the only place big enough to hold the thousands of people who wanted to have their say. You have to imagine this place. It wasn't a fancy palace. It was a wooden building with hard benches, smelling of wet wool coats, and wood smoke. It was packed so tight that people were standing in the aisles and spilling out into the streets. Inside, the air was thick with the sound of shouting and debate. Men from all walks of life were there. You had wealthy merchants in silk vests sitting next to rugged blacksmiths with soot on their hands. You had young apprentices who were just teenagers standing next to old men who had lived in Boston their whole lives. In these meetings, everyone had a voice. Samuel Adams was often the one leading the charge. He wasn't a great public speaker in the way we think of politicians today. He didn't have a booming voice, but he knew how to move people's hearts. He told the crowd that the arrival of the tea was an attack on their rights. He warned them that if they let this tea land, they would be handing over the keys to their city to a tyrant. The crowd would roar in agreement. Not one drop, they would shout. They sent messengers to the governor, demanding that he allow the ships to leave the harbor and go back to England without paying the tax. But Governor Hutchinson was a stubborn man. He lived in a fancy house outside the city and felt that the mob in Boston needed to be put in its place. He refused to give the ships a permit to leave. He told them the ships were staying until the tea was unloaded. This back and forth went on for nearly 2 weeks. Every day, the meeting house was full. Every day, the answer from the governor was the same: no. The people were being backed into a corner. They had tried to follow the law. They had tried to talk it out. They had tried to use politics. But as the deadline of December 16th approached, it was becoming clear that words weren't going to be enough. The time for talking was almost over, and the time for action was drawing near. People began to realize that the law was being used as a weapon against them. If the law said they had to pay a tax they never agreed to, then maybe the law was wrong. This realization was the spark that would soon turn into a flame. December 16th, 1773, arrived with a bone-chilling cold that seemed to sink right into your marrow. This was the final day. If the tea wasn't sent back or destroyed by midnight, the British authorities were legally allowed to seize it. Everyone in Boston knew that if the British soldiers took control of that tea, they would force it onto the market and the tax would be paid. The battle for the soul of the colonies was down to its final hours. Early that morning, even more people started pouring into the city. They came on horseback, in wagons, and on foot from towns miles away like Milton, Lexington, and Concord. They weren't just curious onlookers. They were worried citizens who knew that what happened in Boston that day would affect their children and grandchildren. By noon, over 5,000 people had crammed themselves into and around the Old South Meeting House. At the time, the entire population of Boston was only about 16,000. This meant nearly a third of the city was gathered in one spot, waiting for a miracle. In the center of this storm was a young man named Francis Roch. He was only 23 years old, and he was a Quaker who owned the ship Dartmouth. Roch was in a terrible position. He didn't want to get involved in politics. He just wanted his ship to be safe. If he tried to sail out without permission, the British warships guarding the harbor, the HMS Active and the HMS Kingfisher, had orders to sink him. If he stayed and the tea was destroyed by a mob, he'd lose his livelihood. The leaders of the meeting told Roch he had to make one final attempt. They ordered him to ride out to the governor's country estate in Milton, about 7 miles away, and ask for a pass that would allow his ship to sail past the British cannons. Roch didn't want to go, but looking at the thousands of angry faces in the meeting house, he knew he didn't have a choice. He climbed onto his horse and rode out into the freezing rain and slush. While Roch was gone, the crowd waited. Hours passed. It started to get dark. Inside the meeting house, The air grew thick and heavy. People were tired, hungry, and cold, but no one left. They told stories, they gave speeches, and they tried to keep their spirits up. Every time the door opened, a hush would fall over the room, everyone hoping it was Roch returning with good news. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional cough or the sound of the wind rattling the windows. Everyone knew that the sun would set soon, and once it did, the 20-day limit was almost up. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and they were just waiting for someone to push them. The hope for a peaceful resolution was fading with the light. It was after 6 o'clock in the evening when Francis Roch finally walked back into the Old South meeting house. He looked exhausted, his clothes damp from the winter mist. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the wooden floor as he made his way to the front of the room. Samuel Adams stood there, watching him closely. Roch delivered the news everyone expected, but no one wanted to hear. Governor Hutchinson had refused one last time. He told Roch that the ships would not be allowed to pass the forts until the tea was unloaded and the taxes were paid in full. The governor was basically calling their bluff. He thought that if he held his ground, the colonists would eventually give up and go home to their warm beds. The crowd erupted in a low rumble of anger. The legal path was officially dead. There were no more meetings to have, no more letters to write, and no more people to plead with. They had done everything by the book, and the book had been slammed shut in their faces. For a moment, it felt like the movement might fall apart under the weight of the governor's refusal. That was when Samuel Adams stood up. He looked out at the thousands of faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He didn't shout. He didn't call for a riot. He simply said, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." To an outsider, it might have sounded like a statement of defeat. But to the men waiting in the shadows, it was the secret signal they had been waiting for. Almost as soon as the words left his mouth, a piercing war whoop rang out from the gallery. It sounded like a wild, high-pitched cry that cut through the gloom. Suddenly, another shout came from the back of the room, and then another from the street outside. "To the wharf," someone shouted. "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight." The meeting house exploded into motion. People started pushing toward the doors, their boots thumping loudly on the floorboards. The orderly meeting was over, and something much more dangerous was beginning. Samuel Adams stayed behind, trying to keep the crowd from getting too out of control, but the energy was already out in the streets. The plan that had been whispered about in the back rooms of taverns for days was finally being put into action. As the crowd poured out of the Old South meeting house, small groups of men began to break away and head into the dark alleys and side streets. These weren't just random people. These were organized groups of sailors, carpenters, and apprentices. They ducked into the shadows of blacksmith shops and printing houses. In the darkness, they began to change their appearance. They didn't have Hollywood costumes. They had to use whatever was lying around. They smeared their faces with coal dust, soot from chimneys, and red grease paint to hide their identities. They wrapped old blankets around their shoulders and stuck feathers in their hair or tied their hats in strange ways. They wanted to look like Mohawk Indians. Now, they weren't trying to trick anyone into thinking they were actually Native Americans. Everyone knew they were Bostonians. The Indian disguise was a symbol. In the minds of the colonists, the Native Americans were symbols of a free, untamed America. People who didn't answer to a king across the sea. By dressing this way, the men were saying they were no longer British subjects. They were something new. It also served a very practical purpose. If you couldn't identify the men, you couldn't hang them for treason later. These men, about 100 to 150 of them, divided into 3 organized groups. They were led by men who knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't carrying guns. Instead, they carried axes and hatchets. They knew that if they brought guns, it would look like a massacre or a war. They wanted this to be a focused act of destruction, not a bloody battle. They marched down toward Griffin's Wharf in surprising silence. There was no singing, no shouting, and no drunken yelling. The only sound was the rhythm of their boots on the cobblestones and the occasional clink of an axe blade against a belt. The people of Boston lined the streets, watching them pass like ghosts in the night. There was a sense of awe and fear in the air. People pulled their children close as the soot-faced men hurried by. Everyone knew that once these men reached the water, there was no turning back. They were about to commit a crime against the British Empire, and the penalty for that was death. Yet, there was no hesitation in their step. They were men on a mission. The Mohawks reached Griffin's Wharf just as the moon was starting to peek through the clouds. The three ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay side by side in the dark water. They looked like sleeping giants, unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. The men didn't run or scream. They moved with a quiet, chilling discipline that showed this was a mission, not a riot. As the first group reached the Dartmouth, the leader stepped forward. A few sailors were on deck, looking confused and terrified as these dark, soot-faced figures climbed over the railings. The leader didn't draw a sword or point a gun. Instead, he walked straight up to the ship's mate and calmly asked for the keys to the hatches and a few candles so they could see what they were doing. The ship's crew was completely outnumbered. They looked at the axes in the men's hands and the determined looks on their faces and realized there was no point in fighting. They handed over the keys. The men promised the sailors that no one would be hurt and that the ship itself would not be damaged. Their target was the tea and nothing else. One by one, the groups boarded all three vessels. On the Beaver, which had been stuck in quarantine for several days due to a smallpox scare, the men moved just as efficiently. They worked in pairs and trios. Some men went below deck into the hold, where the air was stale and smelled of old wood. Others stayed on deck to man the ropes and pulleys. The silence was the most haunting part of it all. Thousands of people were standing on the wharf just a few yards away, watching in total stillness. There were no cheers, no taunts, and no shouting. The only thing you could hear was the wind whistling through the ship's rigging and the rhythmic thud of boots on the wooden decks. It was as if the whole city was holding its breath, knowing that they were witnessing a moment that could never be taken back. The Mohawks began to haul the first massive chests of tea up from the dark belly of the ship, and the real work began. The sailors stood back, watching as their cargo was brought up to the deck. They had never seen anything like this, a group of Indians acting with the precision of a clock. Have you ever tried to move something that weighs 400 pounds? Now imagine doing it in the dark, on a slippery wooden deck, while trying to be as quiet as possible. Each chest of tea was a massive wooden box, reinforced with metal and thick enough to survive a journey across the Atlantic Ocean. These weren't little tins you'd find in a kitchen today. They were heavy, awkward, and built to stay closed. The men worked in a line. Those in the hold would hook the chests to ropes, and the men on deck would haul them up using the ship's cranes. Once a chest hit the deck, two men would step forward with their hatchets. This is where the quiet of the night was broken. The sound of axes biting into the thick wood echoed across the water like cracks of thunder. Thwack, crunch, splinter. They didn't just toss the boxes overboard. If they had thrown the chests in whole, the tea might have stayed dry inside, and the British could have fished it out later. The men had to be thorough. They smashed the lids until the wood splintered into pieces. Then, they would lift the heavy boxes to the edge of the ship and tip them over. As the boxes flipped, a massive cloud of tea leaves would burst into the air before hitting the water. The smell was overwhelming. Imagine the scent of 1,000 cups of tea all at once, mixing with the salty, fishy smell of the harbor. It was sweet, earthy, and strange. The men's hands and faces were covered in tea dust, sticking to the soot and grease they had used for their disguises. They worked for 3 hours straight, swinging their axes until their arms ached and their lungs burned. Chest after chest, the Mohawks methodically destroyed the very thing that the king thought would break their will. They were efficient, almost mechanical in their movements. There was no time for breaks or conversation. Every swing of the axe was a message being sent to London. The harbor water began to turn dark, thick with the thousands of tea leaves that were sinking into the mud. As the night went on, the harbor began to change. Usually, the water around the docks was dark and clear, but tonight, it was turning into a literal soup. Because the tide was low when they started, the tea didn't just wash away. It began to pile up in huge mounds alongside the ships. In some places, the piles of tea leaves grew so high that they actually touched the sides of the boats, looking like giant brown haystacks rising out of the salt water. Some of the men realized that the tea was piling up so high it might fall back onto the decks. They took long poles and oars and began to push the tea piles out into the current, trying to make sure the water soaked every single leaf. They were like chefs stirring a giant, cold pot of tea that stretched for hundreds of feet. On the shore, The crowd watched in awe. Occasionally, someone would try to sneak forward with a hat or a pocket, hoping to scoop up some of the free tea for themselves. But the Mohawks were strict. This wasn't a looting party, it was a protest. One man was caught stuffing his pockets with tea leaves. The leaders of the group grabbed him, stripped him of his stolen goods, and gave him a rough handling before kicking him back into the crowd. They wanted the world to know they weren't thieves. They didn't steal a single thing, not even a biscuit from the ship's stores. In fact, the men were so careful that when they accidentally broke a padlock belonging to one of the ship's captains, they actually sent a replacement lock to him the very next day. They were there to make a point about liberty and taxes, not to cause mindless destruction. By the time the last chest was smashed and the last leaf was dumped, the harbor was a muddy, tea-stained mess. Over 92,000 pounds of tea were floating in the water. The tea that was meant to fund the king's control over the colonies was now nothing more than garbage floating in the Atlantic tide. The protest was complete, and not a single drop of blood had been spilled. By 9 o'clock that night, the work was finally done. The Mohawks didn't just drop their axes and run. They were meticulous until the very end. The leaders of the groups ordered the men to take brooms and sweep the decks of the 3 ships. They wanted to make sure that every stray leaf of tea was pushed into the harbor and that the ships were left exactly as they had found them, aside from the missing cargo. They even made sure that no damage had been done to the masts, the ropes, or the personal belongings of the sailors. It was a strange, orderly conclusion to such a massive act of defiance. As the men climbed down the rope ladders and back onto the wharf, the massive crowd was still there. Thousands of people had stood in the freezing cold for 3 hours, watching in almost total silence. There had been no cheering, no singing, and no shouting. The weight of what had just happened was sinking in. They had just destroyed property worth nearly $2 million in today's money. They hadn't just dumped tea, they had dumped the king's authority into the salt water. The Mohawks formed into ranks, 2 by 2, just like a small army. A fifer stepped to the front and began to play a simple, quiet tune. The men marched off the wharf and back into the heart of Boston. As they passed the crowds, people began to fall in line behind them. It wasn't a riotous parade. It felt more like a funeral procession or a solemn march. They walked past the houses of British officials and the barracks where British soldiers were sleeping, unaware of the history that had just been made a few blocks away. When the group reached the center of town, they simply melted away. Men slipped into dark alleys, went into the back doors of shops, or hurried home to wash the soot and tea dust off their faces. Within an hour, the streets of Boston were empty. The only sound was the wind blowing off the water and the occasional call of a night watchman. But under the surface, the city was vibrating. Many of the men who participated didn't sleep that night. They sat by their fires, looking at their red, blistered hands, wondering what the morning would bring. They knew the British Empire wouldn't just let this go. The silence of the night was the calm before a storm that would eventually consume the entire continent. The next morning, the sun rose over a Boston that looked and smelled very different. As the tide went out, the evidence of the rebellion was everywhere. Huge, wet mounds of tea leaves were washed up along the shorelines for miles. The water in the harbor had a murky, brownish tint to it. Local kids went down to the water's edge to poke at the piles of leaves with sticks. The air still carried that sweet, heavy scent of dried herbs mixed with salt. One of the most famous moments of the morning happened as the Mohawks were marching home the night before, but the story spread through the city at breakfast time. Admiral Montague of the British Navy had been staying in a house near the wharf. As the men marched past his window, he leaned out and shouted at them. He didn't call for the guards. Instead, he yelled with a bit of a smirk, "Well, boys, you've had a fine, pleasant evening for your Indian caper, haven't you? But mind, you have to pay the piper yet." The Mohawks didn't back down. One of them shouted back, "Never mind, squire. Just come out here, and we'll settle the bill in 2 minutes." It was a bold answer, but the admiral's words were a dark prophecy. Paying the piper meant there would be consequences, and those consequences were going to be severe. Governor Hutchinson was absolutely furious. When he heard the news, he realized that his gamble had failed. He had tried to force the colonists to submit, and instead, they had humiliated him and the British crown. He immediately began writing letters to London, describing the outrage and the lawless mob. He wanted the British army to take over the city. Meanwhile, the British soldiers in the town were on high alert. You could see the red-coated sentries standing a little taller, clutching their muskets a little tighter. The tension was so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. The people of Boston went about their business, but they kept their heads down. They had made their move. Now, they had to wait and see how the most powerful empire on earth would move back. The leaders of the rebellion knew that Boston couldn't stand alone. If the king decided to punish the city, Boston would need the help of the other 12 colonies. They needed to get the word out as fast as possible before the British could tell their own version of the story. They needed someone who was fast, reliable, and knew the roads like the back of his hand. They called on a silversmith named Paul Revere. Today, we mostly remember him for his midnight ride later in the war, but his ride after the Tea Party was just as important. On the morning of December 17th, less than 12 hours after the last chest of tea hit the water, Revere climbed onto his horse. He carried a stack of letters from the Committee of Correspondence. His mission was to ride to New York and Philadelphia to tell them that Boston had stood its ground. It was a brutal journey. The roads were ribbons of frozen mud and slush. The winter wind whipped across the fields, and the nights were long and pitch black. But Revere pushed his horse to the limit. He rode through small villages, stopping just long enough to shout the news to the locals before galloping on. "The tea is in the harbor," he would cry out. "Boston has acted." When he reached New York, the news was met with cheering and celebrations. The people there had been facing the same tea ships and were wondering what to do. Boston's bold move gave them courage. In Philadelphia, the bells of the churches were rung in honor of the Bostonians. For the first time, the colonies weren't just 13 separate places. They were starting to feel like a single, united force. Revere's ride took him over 700 miles in less than 2 weeks. By the time he returned to Boston, he was exhausted, but he brought back a message that changed everything. You are not alone. The other colonies promised to support Boston if the British attacked. The Tea Party had started as a local protest, but thanks to the messengers on horseback, it was turning into a continental revolution. The spark lit in the dark waters of Griffin's Wharf was now a fire spreading through the hearts of every colonist from Maine to Georgia. They began to see that their struggle was one and the same. It took several weeks for the news of the Boston Tea Party to reach the shores of England. In the 18th century, information only traveled as fast as a wooden ship could sail across the Atlantic. When the news finally arrived in London in early 1774, it hit the British government like a lightning bolt. King George III and his Prime Minister, Lord North, were absolutely stunned. They didn't see the Tea Party as a protest. They saw it as an act of high treason and a direct insult to the power of the British Empire. To the king, the colonists were like disobedient children who had finally gone too far. He believed that if he didn't punish Boston, the other colonies would think they could get away with anything. In the halls of Parliament, the mood was angry and vengeful. They didn't want to talk about representation or rights anymore. They wanted to make an example of Boston. They wanted to crush the spirit of the rebellion before it could spread any further. In response, the British government passed a series of laws that the colonists would soon call the Intolerable Acts. The first and most devastating was the Boston Port Act. This law ordered the British Navy to close Boston Harbor completely. Starting June 1st, 1774, no ships were allowed to enter or leave the port. Not for tea, not for lumber, and not even for food. The lifeblood of the city was being cut off. But the king didn't stop there. He also passed laws that took away Massachusetts' right to govern itself. He sent a British general, Thomas Gage, to become the new governor and brought in thousands of regular British troops to occupy the city. They were sent to live in people's homes and keep the citizens under constant watch. The king thought these harsh measures would force the people of Boston to beg for mercy. He thought they would quickly pay for the destroyed tea just to get their harbor back. But he was wrong. Instead of breaking their spirit, the king's wrath only served to weld the 13 colonies together in a way they had never been before. By the summer of 1774, Boston looked like a ghost town. The once busy wharves, where hundreds of ships used to dock, were now empty and quiet. The British warships sat in the harbor like sharks, their cannons pointed at the city. Thousands of sailors, dock workers, and merchants were out of work. Families were beginning to go hungry because they couldn't sell their goods or buy supplies from the outside world. It was a dark, desperate time, and the British expected the city to surrender any day. But then, something incredible happened. The intolerable acts backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of being afraid that they would be next, the other colonies were inspired by Boston's sacrifice. They realized that if the king could close the port of Boston, he could close the ports of New York, Charleston, or Philadelphia too. A massive wave of support began to flow toward the besieged city. From all over the continent, supplies started arriving in Boston, not by sea, but by land. South Carolina sent hundreds of barrels of rice. Connecticut sent large flocks of sheep. Virginia and Maryland sent flour and money. Even people from tiny rural villages sent whatever they could spare. Israel Putnam, a farmer from Connecticut, personally drove a herd of sheep all the way to Boston to feed the hungry families. The city was under siege, but it wasn't alone. The British soldiers, who were now living in tents on the Boston Common, watched in confusion as the colonists continued to resist. The city had become a symbol. Every day the harbor remained closed was a day that the idea of American independence grew stronger. People were no longer just fighting for cheaper tea or lower taxes. They were fighting for their survival and their right to exist as a free people. The Mohawks, who had dumped the tea, had started a fire that the British Navy couldn't put out with all the water in the Atlantic. The night of December 16, 1773, was more than just a protest. It was the point of no return. Less than 2 years after the tea hit the water, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired just a few miles away at Lexington and Concord. Many of the same men who had smeared soot on their faces and climbed onto the Dartmouth were the ones who picked up their muskets to fight for a new nation. Today, the Boston Tea Party is remembered as one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in history. But its real legacy isn't just about tea or taxes. It's about the power of ordinary people to stand up against something they believe is wrong. It's about the idea that a government only has power if the people give it to them. The men who participated in the Tea Party were ordinary people, carpenters, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, who risked everything for a principle. If you go to Boston today, you can still stand on the spot where the ships were docked. The water is still there, and the air still feels heavy with history. The tea has long since dissolved into the salt water, and the wooden ships have rotted away, but the spirit of that night remains. It's the spirit that says we have a voice, and we have a right to be heard. The Boston Tea Party taught the world that you don't need a huge army to change the course of history. Sometimes, all you need is a clear goal, a bit of courage, and a few friends who are willing to work through the night. It was the night that America stopped being a collection of colonies and started being a country. It was the night they rebelled over tea, but in doing so, they found something much more valuable. They found their freedom. They showed that when people unite for a common cause, even the most powerful empire in the world has to take notice. The ripples from those tea chests are still felt today in every democratic nation on earth. The events of that cold December night set off a chain reaction that eventually led to the birth of the United States. It's a reminder that even the smallest actions can have massive consequences. When those men walked onto those ships, they didn't know if they would be arrested, hanged, or forgotten by history. They did it because they believed in a future where they could make their own choices. Think about the risks they took, not just for themselves, but for a country that didn't even exist yet. It makes you wonder, what would you be willing to stand up for today? What tea would you be willing to dump to protect your rights? Thank you for listening to this story of the night America rebelled. If you enjoyed this journey back to 1773, make sure to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Boston Tea Party. And if you want to hear more stories about the moments that shaped our world, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story counts, and we're glad you're here to hear them.